If I could have your attention, please. All right, everyone. Thank you very much. If I could have your attention, please, we are going to get started with the formal part of our luncheon. If I could have your attention, please. Hello, everyone. My name is Bruce Sellery. I am the president of the Canadian Club of Toronto and your host today. Welcome to those of you in the room, and welcome to those of you joining us on live stream today. We are thankful for the support of our generous sponsors. Today, I'd like to acknowledge National Public Relations, represented by Andrea Mandel-Campbell, and Scotiabank, represented by Mark Mulrooney. Thank you very much for your commitment to the club. And to its mission to engage Canadians in what matters most. Now, I am very happy to introduce today's speaker. Stephen A. Schwarzman is the chairman, CEO, and co-founder of Blackstone, a firm he co-founded in 1985. It is now a leading multi-billion-dollar global investment firm with 2,500 employees in 26 cities around the world. Schwarzman's business success is matched by his generous philanthropy. Listen to this list. His contributions have helped establish a new center at the University of Oxford focused on the humanities. At MIT, his gift will establish a new college that will study artificial intelligence. There's a new student center at Yale, and the creation of an international fellowship program, Schwarzman Scholars, focused on educating China's future leaders. Mr. Schwarzman was named one of Time's 100 most influential people. He topped Forbes' list for the most influential people in finance and was included on Forbes' top 50 world's most powerful people. It's kind of intimidating. Geez, wow. This year, he published his first book, What It Takes, Lessons in the Pursuit of Excellence. It quickly became a New York Times bestseller. Now, moderating this conversation is business journalist Amanda Lang, herself a best-selling author. Lang has worked for ROB TV, CNN, CBC Television, and is now an anchor at B&M Bloomberg. Stephen Schwarzman, Amanda Lang, I am pleased to pass the Canadian Club of Toronto podium over to you. Welcome.
I'm going to let you go first. Thank you very much, Bruce. And it's great to be here. What I don't want to do is recap what's in your book, because the book is here. People should buy it. It's why it's a bestseller. It's a good book. It's free. But listen, as an author, I think you should also buy it. So take the free one, give it away, buy a new copy.
We just paid him to say it was great.
Right.
It was fantastic.
But I was struck by why you wanted to write a book. At your stage of life, what it was that kind of really motivated you to feel like you had something to say that was worth sharing. What is that impetus?
Well, it was sort of a two-parter. The first is that about 10 years ago, Hank Paulson, who was our Treasury Secretary in the United States, called me and said, you ought to write a book, because he wrote a book. It's very successful. And I told him I had nothing to say, so I don't need to write a book. He said, well, at least record some stuff so you don't forget it. So I did a little of that for 2 years, and then I lost interest in the whole project, and that was that. And then I was, probably about 4 years ago or so, I was in the Middle East meeting with the head of a sovereign wealth fund, and he was new, he was royal family. I had a 5-minute handshake, and that turned into 2.5 hours, because as an American, you actually say things you shouldn't. And so with royal family people, we treat them just like pretty much regular people. And I was curious as to what his objectives were and so forth, and he wanted to get my views on things regarding how to manage money and sovereign funds and hiring people. And so that took like 2.5 hours to do that. In the middle of it, I tried to sell one of our products to him. And he said, please don't do that. He said, we're going to buy them anyhow. He said, I don't want to waste my time, hearing a pitch. Keep talking to me about how to run our operation. And so, okay, that was interesting. 2.5 hours instead of 5 minutes. And then what started happening is I was going around the world, which I do. More and more people started asking me about those type of things. in terms of how to make something run better and develop things and do entrepreneurial things. And 2.5-hour slugs of time after a while gets a little boring. And so I figure if I wrote a book and I could just give them the book whenever they asked, then I'd be relieved. So it turns out to be even worse because now I'm on a book tour talking about the book. So I didn't make much progress, but basically after you've been doing things for decades, and when you start, you think you're smarter than the vast majority of people. Usually your maximum smartest is 32. And then you realize by the time you get older, you weren't so smart then, and you always have a lot to learn. And you make mistakes, particularly when you're younger. And you try and figure out how to not ever make that mistake again. And so this whole process of learning how to do things and re-engineering, sort of your own experience is ultimately what leads to really good success. So I realized if I had known what I know now, I wouldn't have been such a bozo
What would you have done differently? If you knew then what you know now, what would have been different? Other than Edgecombe. We know that you regret Edgecombe.
Well, about this deal we messed up. Yeah, I made a...
Okay, so I will talk about some stuff from the book. Some of you will be familiar. In his entire storied career, Steve Schwarzman got one thing wrong. And he won't let it go, Edgecombe. It was $300 million, not nothing. But it did change your culture internally. So it is material. That's one of the reasons you write about it, is it changed the way you think about decision making.
Yeah, it's when you make a mistake, most people try and wish it away, not pay attention to it. Or if you're in an organization and somebody who's working with you makes a mistake, most people blame that person. But if you're the person in charge, you're the bozo who hired them. You're the person who put them in that position. You're the person who didn't have them supervised correctly. So it's not their fault. It's your fault. And so once you realize that, then you try and re-engineer everything. So we had a deal very early in the firm's history. I had never been an investor. I was an investment banker, so that meant I was a good talker. And that's different than investing. And we managed to raise $850 million as a first-time fund. And that was the biggest first-time fund ever raised. But then we had to invest it, and I had no experience, so I figure, you sort of do this game like King Solomon. You have people come to your desk, and you make pretend you know what you're doing, and you make a decision. Unfortunately, that's not a wise way to do things, which, we had a deal that came in with one of our younger partners, and it was a steel distribution company, and he said it was a great thing. He knew them. We had an exclusive, and we didn't even have any processes to approve investments. And then one of the other partners heard that we were looking at this. No process, right? He heard it. And so he came in to me, sat down in front of my desk and said, Steve, I think this is going to be a disaster, because basically steel distribution companies are making money because steel prices are going up. And as soon as steel prices, and they're selling their old inventory that they bought cheaper, and that when it reverses and prices collapse, this company's going to hemorrhage, and we're going to borrow money, we're going to go bankrupt. So the way I thought you resolve things like this is I called both of them in, got 2 seats in front of my desk, had them do their pitch, and then King Solomon, meaning me, was going to make the wise decision. So I picked the guy who wanted to do the deal. Why? Because he knew more about the deal, right? The other guy was just sort of assuming things. So we did everything wrong. What happened?
Steel prices collapsed and it didn't do well.
Within 3 months, we couldn't pay our principal and interest. And this was sort of shocking to me. Apparently, it was shocking to our investors as well. And one of them called me up and asked me to visit them. I was sort of dreading one of them calling and asking me to visit anyhow, so I visited the person. in an office located on the Hudson River, not in it, but right, on the other side of the road. And so I went in, and so now it was reverse. I was sitting in front of his desk, and the guy just started screaming at me. I was the dumbest he'd ever met. He's sorry he ever heard of me. He's sorry he gave me any money. What a disaster, and it just went on and on. And in my family, nobody raised their voice. It's just the way I was raised. I thought it was normal until I had roommates in college. And I realized their families didn't operate like that, but mine did. So that's good for me in a way, because I can figure things out with people speaking, and I hear their voices in sort of an amplified way and what they're intending. When somebody's screaming at you, it's not like screaming. It's like screaming turned up like 3 ratchets. And I was sitting in front of this man, and my face was getting red and hot, and I realized I was going to start crying. I was so ashamed of losing this money. And then I realized I wasn't supposed to be crying. I'm not allowed to cry. So I gutted through this meeting, and I went out in that parking lot and sort of looked over. The sun was out bouncing off the water. It was fall, all these beautiful leaves. And I said, this is never going to happen to me again in my career. It's never going to lose money. We're going to design a system so that we can't lose money. Because actually the way it works out in life is if you never lose money and you're in areas that grow and sectors that grow in that country, and you're on leverage and you improve the asset, you'll make double the S&P index. You'll make double the stock market, and you won't lose money. And that's basically what we did, because we designed the solution. So the solution is pretty simple. Don't depend on me. That's where you start. And that you realize that a bunch of smart people are better than one. And that when you have an approval process, you should have, numerous people at the table, not one. We use about 6 to 8. And you have to realize that the people who bring you things to be approved, they want them approved. So they'll fashion them any way they can to make sure that you say yes. So it's a bit of an adversarial thing without the people disliking each other. And so you have to stop that. And the way you stop it is you make them write things down. You make them sort of give you lists of what risks are. And then you have this group around the table get those documents a few days ahead so you can catch up and sort of think about what they wrote. And the job of the people around the table is to attack what's been written, to look at all the risk factors, to make sure you don't let anything slip through by way of a risk. And when you decide on something, you know how much risk you're taking. It's essential that the people at the table, most organizations, you have the one really smart person who's in charge, and then you have the other people who I call them paid audiences. They sit there and watch somebody interrogate somebody, and that one person drives the decision. The problem with that is you don't need anybody else at the table, right? What are they doing there? I only want people at a table if they're participating. So the rule is everybody has to recite. It's like a class where you can't hide, right? And that means you have to be prepared. You have to think about it. So if you get 7 really smart people thinking about an issue instead of just people lined up in front of my desk, you will get dramatically different outcomes. And then what happens is no matter how good the team is, they've forgotten things. And you send them back, they got to do the same thing, and you got to have your 2 days. What they normally do, their instinct, is to come to the meeting and like jump across the table and give you some documents. Hey, I'm sorry, I couldn't get it done in time. Here it is, believe what I say, let's go do it. This is human behavior, apparently, they think they're going to fool you. So you go, no, sorry, I don't want to have the meeting. We need time to think about things. And you send them away, and you do that 2 or 3 times. By the time you finish, you know exactly how much risk you're taking on each one of those variables. You know whether they're correlated. And so you make a decision basically as a team, because anybody's allowed to say, I think that's the wrong assessment, and then you debate it. So what happens when you go ahead with something, these people on the team aren't completely responsible for the success or failure. Because when things go wrong, about 80 to 90% of the time, it's one of those 3 key risks. And all that means is that the grown-ups have misassessed the risk. Okay, it's not the team's fault. That way you never have nervous people, sort of working with you, because the success of failure is sort of, in a way, it's sort of pre-baked. The final thing I would say, because I'm ruining your interview because it's too long an answer, we've looked at where we've come out the last 15 years. We've had 700 investments that we call control investments, where we determine all the things. We've had 1 bankruptcy, no liquidations out of 700. So that means we've really screwed up 1/10 of 1% with leverage products. A normal bank will lose a lot more money than that as in a senior position. And so we've accomplished our objective. And if you do that, you go from no assets, where we started, to the biggest in the world. But it's based at $554 billion at the moment. But it's really because of this change, a change in paradigm.
One of the things, and I should just remind everybody, Bruce said it, but there are cards on your table, I believe, if you want to write questions, and people that will collect them and bring them up to me, and if I like them, I might ask them. One of the things that comes through in the book from your very earliest days is that although I don't think you felt smarter than other people, you certainly felt equal to other people. People in positions of authority didn't frighten you. You were willing to call up the dean of admissions at Harvard and say, why didn't you let me in? You were willing to...
Didn't work.
Didn't work, to his everlasting regret. But at a certain point along the way, when you do what you've done, people begin to be afraid to tell you the truth, right?
No.
They begin to be afraid to, you're wealthy, B, you're powerful, you employ a lot of people, you buy a lot of things. How do you maintain an air that says you can continue to tell me I'm wrong when you're sitting in the position you're sitting in?
Well, we have 2 people from Blackstone here, dude.
Should I be asking
Are
Tom?
you afraid to tell me if I'm wrong? And people, we run. By the way, I'm not like this at the firm. I'm not this animated. If you're running something, you actually have to be much more measured. You have to be quiet. You have to be the last person speaking. There are a variety of techniques you learn as a management. So as a manager, which is not a natural act for me, I've learned it, where you have to make everyone comfortable. You don't want to dominate anything, because then it's about you. It's not about, sort of them or a business. And so, I have a different internal approach to communications, and you let everybody play out. We have a culture, because I know I'm not the smartest person in the room. No one needs to tell me that I love to hear what people have to say. We're all sort of on the same team. So when we start, younger people join our business at Blackstone. I give them an orientation. So do other people. It's 3 weeks. I get 2 hours. And I tell them, I said, look, you have to assume we're all equal, right? I said, you're probably smarter than I am, but the only difference is I've had, like decades to learn things, you haven't, but we're going to treat you as if you're the same as the most senior person in the business, because you will become that. You just have the handicap of not knowing as much in substance, but not in terms of personality and capability. And so everything we do is open and is questioning. We're trying to avoid mistakes. We're trying to teach people all the time how to think about the world or what they're doing. We let people know when they're younger that there's no premium for reinventing the wheel. If you're asked to do an assignment, all we care is that you get the assignment done. Ask somebody else who's done it. There's almost nothing new in finance in the first 5 years of your career. So don't waste your time. You're all smart. Like, ask somebody. We have an asking culture, and everybody's open. And every Monday, each of our groups meet, and we go around the world trying to, talking about what's happening in the world, and we all try to figure out where are we in the cycle, where are we in this kind of industry, what's going on with this company. Anyone can participate. So if you set up a culture that's totally open, which I'm not as dominant like this. I mean, it's an interview, so I'm trying to entertain you. But, I couldn't be like this and have any organization, right? It's important that the people who work there understand that they're important. In finance in particular, there's no one who wants to be a private in that army. Every person who joins wants to be at least a lieutenant colonel, and if they're honest, they all want to be generals. So how do you manage a group of people who all want to be generals? Well, you start treating everyone equally, and then you don't have that frustration. And the worst thing in the world is that we make a mistake. And once people know that their obligation is to stop us from making a mistake, on the receiving end, you have to be totally open and flexible. When somebody says, I think we're going the wrong way, they could be right. They're all smart. Everything everybody says is worthy of evaluation and consideration. And so when you say, how do you, people are scared of you, I don't think, people, if they saw me today, they'd be scared of me. But they don't see that person at work, and that's not how you would manage a business.
In the course of Blackstone's existence, you've had some really lucky moments and some really well-timed moments that weren't luck. The luckiest maybe was closing your first fund a little early, just before Black Monday, 1987. Probably a little more prescient, that you could take a little more credit for, was avoiding the mortgage crisis, seeing it and profiting from it, but really basically staying out of it. Where do you see today? The world has changed a lot. We have very strange monetary policy for a long time now. Negative yields around the world have become something that we actually have to contemplate and live with. Where do you see today the things you would A, embrace, or B, avoid?
The last thing you said was, where do I see?
What you would embrace or avoid. Where are the risks?
Yeah, we have a world that's got some odd things now. This negative interest rate thing is not even understandable. I mean, if you had money and you put it in a bank, would you expect to pay them interest? I mean, I'd buy a warehouse and hire a few security guards and just put the money there. And, at least I wouldn't have to pay the bank. So this idea of negative interest rates is I think, very difficult to comprehend. And we're sort of forcing growth on the world. We've got very low interest rates every place, lower in the United States than countries that, really are, don't have, as good prospects. So you have to look at this and say, where will excess, be created? What do you have to avoid? What do you have to assume? Well, for one thing, you have to assume is that this condition will not stay the same, because nothing in finance ever stays the same, let alone, sort of forced, sort of interest rate suppression. And so when that reverses, you have to say what's going to happen, and are you positioned in a way where you're going to be really damaged? for that. Second thing is this type of interest rate environment really props up equity prices. All financial assets pretty much have gone up dramatically. So that's artificial, sort of wealth creation. It's actual because you could sell those assets. But, you have to recognize that because that can't stay forever, that you have to make sure that if you own something, you're not ultimately overpaying for it. And that means you have to have things that grow faster than regular stuff, because that's your insulation. And you don't pay too much to do that. And if that requires you to do less things, then you do less things, because that other scenario will happen.
I was trying to explain to somebody at work how wealthy you are. Ordinary people actually sometimes have a hard time with billion and million, as though it's similar. And I started to explain it, and I said, just as long as I've been talking, he's earned more than you have this year. You have a lot of money. There is a growing sense that something has to be done about the wealth divide in America, and it's seen less as a system that's gone sort of out of whack, as something that really needs to be recalibrated. What is your view about how do we fix this? It is a problem, there's no question.
Yeah, well, I think the problem, there have always been wealthy people in the United States. There are wealthy people in China, there are wealthy people in Canada, but the dialogue has changed. And I don't think it's because you have wealthy people. I think it's because you have something I would characterize as income insufficiency for lower income people and for middle income people. And there's a variety of reasons that's happened, and it has to be corrected, because otherwise you strain the fabric of a liberal democracy. And so there are a variety of different policy ways to do that. And different people like different choices within that menu. I think you have to start with a very significant increase in the minimum wage. And this would affect, in the United States, for example, if you doubled the minimum wage, this would affect directly about 15% of the population. But what's interesting is that would jump the minimum wage so high over what some other people are being paid that it would actually lift about 35% of the people in the workforce. And that's a good thing, because they then will have more purchasing power. And in effect, that's a tax on the business community, because that will reduce profit margins. Some will be passed on, but it'll be a tax, and that's okay, because this money's got to come from someplace, and this part of the sort of the population has to be addressed. There are other things. As you look at this, you say, what's going on here? Why aren't people having as good a shot? Some is because financial institutions were repressed in terms of credit extension after the financial crisis. Part was regulatory, where basically they shut down the housing market by requiring big deposits, but it's also because education hasn't kept up with the change in the workplace. So, for example, in the United States, which I'm more familiar with than Canada, we used to, when I was younger, in the late Middle Ages, that we were ranked as one of the top 2 or 3 primary, secondary education in the world. We're now somewhere between number 25 and 30. In math, we're solidly in the mid-30s. Now, how do you compete globally when your population isn't getting educated? I mean, I'll give you one fact that you'll probably find sort of interesting. At least I did. That's why I'm sharing it. That I was in China a few months ago talking to one of the top people there, and he was telling me they've decided that what they're going to do is teach computer science to every student in their country. Now, they got 1.4 billion people. They're all not students. But can you imagine that country with its growth rates, everybody being exposed to computer science? In the United States, the number of students who would be studying computer science is less than 5%. These are the same people complaining about income inequality, complaining about capitalism. Education had nothing to do with capitalism. This has to do with being in touch with where the world is going. It's going to be an information-based society, increasingly, and every country has to tune up what it's doing educationally. There are all kinds of things you can do to help people. Corporations, like they do in Germany, basically take on the responsibility for non-college educated high school students to train them for real jobs that are in the economy so they don't get dumped into the marketplace without skills. This is normal in Germany. It can be done by the business community in virtually any country, and with the right leadership, the business community would respond to that. And that would take care of other people. They could get adequately trained before they're out. So there are any number of policy mechanisms that can address this problem. One further one, which I like a lot. All of us went to school. In terms of being educated, if you have a great teacher, you learn a lot. Each of us can probably remember the 2 or 3 great teachers that we had. So teachers basically, with the advent of women's liberation, which started around 1970, 71, women used to become teachers because they were denied effectively entry into a lot of other occupations. And that was where historically the best and brightest of women went. There were few occupations. Teaching was one. When you could be, sort of an investment banker or a lawyer or a surgeon and so forth, the mix of people who went into education dramatically changed. And ironically, the compensation didn't keep up. And so I think that if you want to address this kind of problem, we should have teachers be the only occupation in society which is not taxed. They should not pay tax. Because what that would do would be have a dramatic increase in income for people who wanted to be teachers. And the second thing in terms of importance is it would mark teachers apart from everybody else in society as a privileged group and an important part of our societal structure. So I've obviously thought about this area because it's essential that we address what needs to happen. Simple cash transfers, are not as effective as I think these other approaches.
People in the room want to know, and you get asked this question, but I've never seen you give a really blunt, frank answer to it. But maybe Canada's the place to do it. About Donald Trump. But in all seriousness, I mean, you've been close to many people in power. I mean, you worked through the last credit crisis with Barack Obama. You served Donald Trump on a committee that was disbanded. What do you really think about him as a leader and what's happening to America?
It was the smart Steve that didn't comment. and it's the consistent one that won't. I've worked with a lot of different people, and you know a lot of people. This is what happens when you get older. You know a lot of people. It was pretty strange when all of a sudden the guys who were running for president of the United States were people I knew. They're all age peers. So weird. And so I don't talk about any of them, just because I don't.
Is there a policy that the U.S. is pursuing that you wish it was not? And I mean, I guess I think of, you've done a lot of work on the trade file, and the U.S. has gone down a very protectionist path, led by people that know better.
I don't think, for the most part, the U.S. isn't trying to go down a protectionist path. What happened with, trade is after World War II, the U.S. had 70% of global GDP. This is almost unimaginable. You know, Europe had been basically knocked down. Russia destroyed. Japan destroyed. China destroyed. We were, I guess, along with you, sort of the last people standing. And so what happened after World War II is that the U.S. wanted the rest of the world to recover. So we did things like the Marshall Plan and helped Japan recover because that was good for those people. It was good for the world. After a while, some of those countries came to the U.S. and said, would you mind if we set up some tariff walls so we could grow our domestic industries? And whoever was running the U.S. at the time, they didn't say big tariff walls, they said little itty bitty tariff walls. And you'd say, sure, if that helps you, we want you to recover. So what happened is those tariff walls that were put in place in the 50s and 60s, and to some degree the 70s, but by the time you got to that period, these countries had really recovered. But they didn't drop those walls. In fact, they increased them. And so what the U.S. was faced with was being the most accessible country in the world, cheapest to bring products in, because we always wanted to have these other countries
to its great
develop.
economic advantage.
Yes.
Its openness was to its own economic advantage.
Right. So we wanted them to be able to export to us or to anyone. Yeah. And we found ourselves by the 1990s in an extremely disadvantaged position. So what happened, they have these global trade rounds, right? Nobody even knows what this means. You know, in like Montevideo or Doha. And these things go on for like 5 to 10 years. What are they trying to do? They're trying to get global barriers harmonized. The last 2 rounds had nothing to do with Donald Trump. The rest of the world sort of said to the U.S., I'm sorry, I don't want to change. I don't care if this is unfair to you. We have it, you don't, we're not changing. So both global trade rounds in the last 20 years have failed, okay? So you happen to have a new US government, and asking everyone politely clearly didn't work, right? And so this group took a different approach and is using, tariffs to get people's attention, to basically harmonize access between countries. That's the whole game. And it's not to be protectionist, it's to be equal, right? That's the theory of what's trying to happen. And what happens is even when you do that, sometimes people say, I'm not interested in doing anything. So it gives you some idea how difficult it is to just be equal. This is a game of being equal. It's not a game of, trying to be protectionist.
I want to finish on a personal story. You open the book with the story about your dad, successful small businessman, not interested in your ambitious visions for the family firm to be the Eatons of Philadelphia. I was curious to know, you obviously were very different, and you make that point. He was not an entrepreneur. He was happy with his moderate success, right? His upper income lifestyle. When you did become the massive success you did, how did his life change? How did your parents' life change after you became?
My parents' life never changed. We had 3 brothers, and our relationships are the same. We love each other. We laugh a lot. How did my parents' lives change? So I gave my parents some money because I wanted them to have a better life. So when my dad was dying when he was 82, and I was the oldest brother. So, I was in charge, apparently nominated by the family to manage what happened with, when the parent dies, somebody's got to look after the situation. So I was sitting there talking to my dad, and he said, "Steve, I just want to, let you know how I've left my affairs." And he said, "I've got a few bank accounts or whatever, and here's how much, I have in each of these bank accounts." So there's one bank account that had some weird number in it. And I said, "Dad, what's this for, this bank account?" And he said, "Oh, that's got all the money you've given me in my entire life in it." I said, "You never spent it?" He said, "No." He said, "I know you wanted to feel that you were taking care of us, but we liked our life the way it was. So there's all the money." And weird things happen when parents are going away. But that was one of the, I sort of shook my head and said, my goodness, my father is really an extraordinary man. And he took the money only to make me feel good. He didn't want to change his life. I wanted him to feel more secure, but he felt totally secure as he was.
It's a beautiful story. Thank you for sharing it, and thank you for your time today.
Mr. Schwarzman, thank you on behalf of the Canadian Club of Toronto and this sold-out crowd of 450 people for an inspiring conversation. Your book and your approach to life is an important reminder for this Canadian crowd of some of the things that make America truly great. The boundless optimism, the confidence, and the determination. I know everybody here is going to be reading the book that you now have, but a few little spoilers. Some examples that I really loved in reading your book, like the time when you were a teenager, and Amanda talked about this, when you called up Harvard, you'd already been accepted to Yale, and said you had told them that they should admit you because, quote, "I will be very successful." Or when you were offered your first job on Wall Street and you admitted you didn't even know what a security was. They offered you $10,000 for your first job, and you actually turned them down because you found out that one of your classmates was going to make $10,000. And you said, "I can only take $10,500 because I have to be the highest paid graduate in my class." And they accepted. Or the point, and the important point that you make through the book that I think is really important for us to take away as Canadians, and that is that you say often in the book, it's just as hard to do something small as it is to do something big. So if you're going to do something, it might as well be huge. Today's event has been a huge success, and I want to thank you for that, and I want to thank the amazing Amanda Lang, both of you, very much. I would also like to thank our sponsors, Scotiabank and National Public Relations. And a big thanks to MediaEvents.ca, Canada's online event space, and BBC for live streaming today's event. On behalf of the Canadian Club, we look forward to seeing you at our next events. Thank you very much.